Good evening and welcome to another episode of Grains of Wisdom, our online webinar, which allows us to have insightful conversations with Noel Sweeney, Powerscourt's distiller and master blender. Thank you for joining us this week. Another week has rolled by and we hope you're all doing very well out there. Again, we are absolutely overwhelmed with the interest and registrations that we've had this week. So thank you so much for joining us. We have people from all over Ireland, Canada, Finland, Germany, and the UK. So you're all very welcome. So as usual, please, you're obviously logged on and on mute and the video is turned off to help the smooth running of the webinar. Please do engage with us on chat and we'd be delighted to put your questions to Noel at the end of his presentation. This evening, we're going to get into the real heart of the whiskey making process, which is the distillation. And I have the lovely stills here behind me, and Noel has prepared a really in-depth presentation for us to bring us through that and really give us his grains of wisdom, which he's accumulated over 30 years. So without further ado, I would like to just caveat that it is a little bit longer than our webinars previously. We're going around 45, 50 minutes mark. So please stay with us. We will be having a refreshment break in the middle. And again, any questions, please get them into us on chat. Thank you so much, and over to you, Noel.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this presentation this evening on grain and spirit distillation. We're going to go through a prepared slideshow, and we're going to start off with a brief introduction into distillation and what distillation is. And because this is fairly long, I want to skip through it fairly quickly, I hope. And again, I hope it is of interest to everybody and not too detailed. So what is distillation? Well, distillation is the process of separating the compounds of substances from a liquid mixture by using selective boiling and condensation. So effectively, we're looking at our beer or wash, and in the beer or wash, we have a whole raft of different compounds. I'm going to start off by talking really about the water and alcohol initially, because that's in the first distillation is basically concentrating up the alcohol and separating it from the yeast and the other byproducts of fermentation that we're not interested in. So basically distillation is a separation technique, and it exploits the difference between boiling points of the components in the mixture. So water, as you can see on the slide, has a boiling temperature of 100 degrees centigrade, while pure ethanol would be around 78 or exactly 78.37 as the slide shows. But if you have a mixture of water and of ethanol, say 50-50, the boiling point isn't either one or the other. The boiling point of ethanol in water will increase. So at 50-50 mixture has about 83 degrees centigrade of a boiling point. So we move on to the next slide, and there are different types of distilling and distillation. So we're going to look at these four. We're going to concentrate on the first two sections. Simple distillation, and that's where we use a pot still, and literally, as it describes, a simple once-off pot still distillation. We also do double distilled, and typically you would find malt whiskies or pot still whiskey is double distilled sometimes as well. Then you have a couple of variations on that. You have the 2.5 times distilled, and we'll have a quick look at that, and then move on to triple distillation. Finally, we're going to have a detailed kind of look at fractional distillation, because a lot of people don't understand much about that aspect of distilling. And this typically involves column stills of maybe more than one as well, because it's a continuous distillation process, and it's quite intriguing to have a look at that. The other two we're not really going to have a look at all. I just mentioned them for the purpose of the presentation tonight. But vacuum distillation is when you're trying to distill something at a very high boiling point and you want to preserve the product that you're distilling maybe, so you can use a vacuum, and by pulling a vacuum on a distillation system, you lower the boiling temperature, so if you wanted to boil something over 150 degrees, pull a vacuum on it, it'll drop the temperature down to 100 or maybe 120, the boiling temperature, depending on how good a vacuum you can pull. I've had experience of doing this. At one stage, I was involved in distilling ethyl vanillin, which is vanilla, and it is a boiling point of 150 degrees at a full vacuum, and it's not an easy thing to achieve, but you do that using a hot oil source. But anyway, steam distillation, just another style of distillation, and there are others. This is not an exclusive list. So we go on to the first type, and that's pot still. Simple enough distillation, where you can see on the left-hand side, you have your container with liquid. You have a heat ring underneath it, so your heat goes in, the liquid boils, and you can see the vapor coming off, going up, hitting the top of the still, or well, whatever you want to call it, the head, and then it condenses slightly, going down the pipe and into what we call a worm or a cooler or a condenser, and it comes out at the end as a cold distillate. Now, cold water is pumped in at the bottom of that condenser, and as you continue to distill across, the heat is taken out at the top, so you get hot water coming out, and that heat can be reused in other series. On the right is a small, more detailed situation where you've tells you about pot still and how it's just a single distillation. Vapor is withdrawn continuously here. Composition of the liquid is pot still, and then etc. So we'll quickly move on to the next stage, which is an example of where we would use a single distillation unit. And this we can see is a cider one on the left, and they're very similar stills. They make cider, and or you can also make French cognac. So on the schematic on the left for the cider, you can see it's a red brick block in which the still is in. This is a direct fired still, so inside there's a burner, and that's heating the vessel inside. And this could be a gas burner, it could be oil, it could also be ordinary coal or fuel of any sort, really. Just fire it in and away you go. And that heats your still. And in the old days down in a lot of distilleries in Ireland, they used to use even turf. But anyway, the heat boils the liquid heads on up through the neck of the still, and this is called a swan neck in this particular demonstration, because that's the way that it looks. That neck goes through a container or vessel, which is a preheater, and a lot of the time you use the heat from the vapor to heat something else, and it condenses from a vapor to a liquid at this stage, and as that liquid is then further cooled as it goes down through the worm and the coils, and that's a big water tank, and coming out at the bottom is your cider in this case. So that's your alcohol, and this is a very basic, simple distillation. But if you control this very carefully, you can achieve quite high strengths and the spirit, but it's a slow process. And again, in production of cider and cognac, you need to take away your heads and also discard the tails, as it were. On the right hand side of the slide, you see a cognac still, very similar to the cider, and again you can see the man, or the kind of fire door on this one. This would have been a solid fired burner. So that's this very simple single one pot still. So when we go up to double distillation, and this gets a little bit more complicated because now we have two stills, and we have a schematic again at the top which shows you the basic operation of a two double distillation malt, peated malt, and or even pot still. So we start with a wash charger where the beer comes from the fermentation, and this charger can either be preheated in some cases, and in our case in particular, the pot ale that's been discharged from the wash still is heating the wash as it enters into the still, and this just saves energy. The heat source here is shown as a fire. Again, you can have a direct fire, or you can have indirect fire or indirect heat, where you use steam through a coil or a pan, or as we'll see in our case, it's kind of like a heating block in a few minutes. So that heats the wash, The wash is typically around about 8 to 10% alcohol. It boils up, the vapor goes up the neck, round through a condenser and through what we call a safe. And the safe is just a device to be able to monitor the flow of the liquid, and you can adjust the heat source then to increase or decrease that. And it also helps you to check the alcohol strength of the distillate that's coming across, because when you get towards the end of distillation, you don't want to distill just water, because that would be totally not what you want in your spirit. So your low wines receiver, we call this low wines, and typically on a wash distillation of 8% or 10% alcohol, you'll end up with a 20-21% alcohol content in your low wines. The low wines are then charged into the spirit still, and also with the low wines, you will see from the spirit still we have faints. And when we distill the low wines, we produce our first distillate is called strong faints, and this would have a lot of the more volatile compounds that you find in the fermentation, and I'll explain a bit more about that shortly. But so the faints are the first thing that we are going to set aside, and that's strong faints, our heads. And it would contain things like, from a chemical point of view, acetaldehyde, ethyl acetate, methanol, those kind of high alcohols, but with very low boiling points. And the highest concentrations of those will come off the still first. As the distillation progresses, the alcohol content will reduce in the still and also in the distillate, so it will eventually end up at zero. But at this stage, we separate off the heads, and then the operator will, or distiller, will change over from the low wines receiver, or heads receiver, or faints receiver, whatever you want to call it, to the spirit receiver, and will continue then to collect the good spirit until we get to a certain stage where we will then stop collecting our spirit and go back and then collect what we call our weak faints, or tails. And the tails would contain the really oily substances and the not too nicely flavored ones as well. And we also want to make sure we don't lose any ethanol in the process. So the remaining alcohol will be in the faints, and that is recycled back into the low wines receiver. And all of that, heads and tails, are combined with the low wines from the wash still and go back into the next distillation. And that cycle of system of recycling these heads and tails continues, and that makes sure that we have a consistent spirit product with the right amount of heads and the right amount of tails, so that we get a balance. And that's key to the production of a good spirit, that you don't have too much heads, you don't have too much tails, but you have enough in the spirit that you're producing. And once you have your spirit, way to the warehouse for casking. So on the photographs underneath, there are two examples of distilleries that have double stills, and there you can see on the left is the Cooley stills, wash still and spirit still. Unusual for them, they're both same capacity, but they can manage that by producing using it takes 2 runs of the wash still, and they get 2 runs out of the spirit still as well, to get 1 run out of the spirit still, I mean. On the right hand side, you can see Kilbeggan Distillery, and these are very small stills. The wash still is on the left, you can see, and the condenser is again the wall at the back. The one on the right is the spirit still, and at the front of that you can see the safe, and the safe is split into 2, so that the low wines is on the left hand side, and then you have your faints and spirit receivers pipes coming out of the safe on the right. And they're both of those receivers, or 3 receivers, are actually in the wall behind that photograph. So we go on to the next stage, and then we look at, well, 2.5 times distilling. I mean to say, who would have thought it? Anyway, here we are, a fine example. Springbank are proud, and they make a beautiful spirit using this technique. Now, what exactly happens in the 2.5 times? So the schematic on the left shows you, we have a wash still, exactly the same as in the previous example. It produces our low wines, and that's into the receiver. Now, at this stage, low wines can go into the middle still, and we call that the low wine still. Some low wines also go into the spirit still. And effectively, that means that low wines can only be distilled twice. But the low wines that goes into the low wine still gets distilled, and that goes into the faints receiver. And the faints receiver is combined with the faints from the distillation of the spirit still, and that is charged into the spirit still. So that part of the distillation is triple distilled, but because the low wines is only once distilled in the other schematic, then you can only claim to do 2.5 times distillation. Now, this system can give you different combinations of flavors in both the heads and tails, and obviously again in the spirit. And then we look at the simple third triple distillation, and I've just thrown this one in here just to be awkward because this is a Scotch. Auchentoshan, a nice distillery outside of Glasgow, they triple distill. And again, if you look at the schematic now, I'm afraid this isn't awfully clear because it's one of these things that I took a picture of a picture, if you know what I mean. So, but anyway, very briefly, this system is that the low wines are produced, the low wines are fed into the second still. The second still then produces your high wines, we'll call it, for want of a better word, and then they are charged into the third still where we get our heads, tails, and spirit. This can give you a higher strength spirit than a simple double distillation. Typically in double distillation, you will get up to about 66% alcohol in your spirit, but with this technique, you get up to 76. And in doing that, you can get slightly more pure spirit, and it's also a way of refining that spirit a little bit more. And that can be either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your own particular individual tastes. So if we look at the next slide, we're going to see our own distillation setup in Powerscourt. This would be along the same lines as what has been done in Auchentoshan, but again, we use this for both malt and pot still. So our beer or wash goes into the first still on the right in this case, and you can see the lovely heating element there. It boils the liquid, the vapor, and across into a condenser through the safe into our low wines receiver. Low wines go into second still. Basic enough operation produces our high wines, as I mentioned earlier, into the high wines receiver. From the high wines is mixed with the faints again from the previous spirit distillation, charged into the spirit still, and through the safe we get then the faints going back into that receiver again, but the spirit is diverted off to our spirit receiver where we will collect it and then discharge it across for maturation. On the photographs down below, you may have seen these before or not. I'm just giving you a photograph on different angles. One on the left, you can see the man doors. We've faced them in that direction. But also I wanted to bring your attention to the design of the still. The wash still has an onion at the bottom of it, and I call that an onion shape. It's about the best way of describing it, I suppose. And I put this in here because in a wash that's very foamy, you get a lot of bubbles forming, and when you start to boil the liquid, these foam bubbles gather and they come up through the neck, and then you have to be very careful that you don't get any carryover. So the onion helps to break down these bubbles a little bit, and they drop back into the still, the membranes or whatever you want to call them. And this vapor is allowed to go up through the neck, across the line arm, into the condenser, and from the condenser to the safe. And in the picture on the right, you can see the safe. That's the low wine safe there. And on the left, then we have the two safes for the intermediate still and the spirit still. And so we'll run on to the next slide. And again, we're looking at the individual parts of the stills. So we're looking at the pot on the left-hand side, shows the man door where we can inspect the still, and you can just see in there the heating element, and the heating element is a photograph up on the right-hand side. There's a blow up of it. At the top, you can see the steam pipe coming in, and this is live steam, but this is what we call a closed circuit heating element. So it's a bit like a radiator in the house, only each one of those vanes would represent like a radiator. So the steam goes in at the top, cools and condenses, because the liquid in the wash or the beer would be much cooler than steam. And that condensate comes out the bottom and collected in the big pipe, and then drains in out the bottom of the still, and is returned. That condensate is returned back to the boiler. And so this is what we call a closed loop. But that heating element boils the liquid. The vapor rises up the neck of the column across then the line arm, and that's what we call that line arm. And the line arm is at an angle so that it drops down towards the condenser, and that collects the liquid, and the liquid is then cooled. The condenser also will take the vapor, of course, and cool that down, and out the bottom of the condenser, the spirit is taken away. There's also cold water going in at the bottom, and that heats the water coming out at the top. And you can notice on that picture as well how the bottom of the condenser is a slightly different color to the top. And that's because the heat has changed the color to a kind of a more browny color, and the bottom is more pink, but that's just at the start. Also on that photograph, you can see what we call a seal pot. This is a safety device. In a distillation system like this, you have to be careful when you're finished distilling if the either draw out the liquid too quick, or if there could be a sudden drop in temperature and the vapor condenses very quickly, then the actual still could collapse in, because the pressure, a vacuum is created in the still. So the seal pot is basically a water valve, and in the case of normal production, there's a slight increase in pressure. The water is just pushed a little bit out, and the vapor is allowed to condense, and that maintains a constant pressure. In the event that something were to happen and you get a sudden vacuum, then that water is sucked in with the air, and the vacuum is released, and your still is safe. So it's just a very simple but effective safety device on the still. The last two photographs is the safe, the one on the right, and here you can see the stainless steel pipe through which the spirit comes, and the spirit flows into that glass bowl and down through the pipe out to a receiver. But there's also, you'll notice, a small little stainless steel pipe coming from the bottom of that larger one, and that drains across into a glass tube where the spirit's allowed to fill up the tube, and it will raise the hydrometer in there depending on the alcohol strength. And the higher the hydrometer floats, will give you an indication to the alcohol content of the spirit that you're measuring. There's also a thermometer there, because the temperature and the density are related to give you the correct reading for alcohol. And this safe device was used to measure the alcohol in the old days, when we didn't have these more modern devices that we have today, handheld density meters and the like, that tell you the alcohol content straight away. This device was used, and it's a backup, of course, to be able to measure the alcohol content without actually taking samples out of the system. So the spirit flows through that, and it's a very easy and a visual way of keeping an eye on the alcohol strength. And the other photograph that you can see is an indication of the size of the stills. And Jerry, one of my colleagues, is standing there beside the still, and this is when it was under construction in Forsyth in Scotland. And this still would be about 3,500 litres in capacity. So we move on to the next slide, and we're getting into now, we've dealt with simple distillation and how it can be used in single, double, 2.5 times, and even triple distillation. We're now looking at a little bit more complex. Fractional distillation is a system by which you have several distillations carrying on at the one time, nearly in succession, if you wish as well. But in this example, in the schematic, we're showing an alcohol content of 10% in the vessel on the left. That's heated up, and the vapor goes up along that line and is condensed into another vessel, for example. So having boiled that, the spirit comes across around 32%, and that could be typical of the strength of the alcohol coming off initially. That alcohol then is heated and boiled, and the vapor goes across and into the next vessel, and now it's 55% alcohol goes across again into the next one, 70, up to 78, 83, 87. So these are different simple distillation steps, one after the other. And so if we were to draw a schematic of this and we look at the bottom left-hand side, we will see how the liquid is the curve on the bottom. And as that liquid, we look at number 1 at the bottom, you will see that liquid is boiled. So the vapor will contain a higher concentration of the volatile liquid. When that's cooled, so it moves up to the next level and the next level and the next level until eventually you get much higher concentrations. The line on the bottom is what they call the liquid strength in mole fractions, but effectively, if you look at 0.4, that's 40% alcohol. And the one on the left is the alcohol content of the vapor. So the liquid is the bottom curve, vapor is the top one. So as a liquid, it boils, it becomes much stronger of the volatile mixture and goes across. Eventually you get to a higher strength. So if you represent that, each one of those is called a theoretical plate. And in a column distillation, we have plates, and these are represented in the diagram in the middle there, which shows you what we call a sieve tray type of an arrangement. So on that diagram, the liquid comes in at the top of the column. Now this column could be 40 foot high or more, and the liquid is usually entered in about maybe 4 plates from the top, and it will flow down through the column through a series of downcomers and weirs. So coming down on the right hand side, flows across the plate, and at the other side is a weir which it has to flow over to get down into the next plate. Now you can see on the plates there are holes, and the vapor, which looks like those little squiggly arrows, the vapor is forced up through the liquid because the vapor is created by the heat from below, and there's more pressure in the vapor than there is in the weight of the liquid. So the vapor is pushed through the liquid in those bubbles, and as it goes through, it heats the liquid to create more or stronger alcohol vapor. So if you take the representation earlier, say it's 10% in the bottom liquid, the vapor now will be 32%. That 32% will get into the next layer, and then the next vapor will be 55%. So this is a very efficient way of distilling, and you can pump the liquid in the top all the time and take it out the bottom, and you have steam going in at the bottom to create your heat source, and at the very top of the column your vapor can be drawn off into a condenser and condensed. So you have a continuous flow of spirit once you are feeding in your wash, and that's how you get this continuous distillation. And it's very efficient and very quick, and it's usually used mostly in grain distillation or grain whiskey distillation, but it's also used in things like production of bourbon and other spirits, rum, vodka, neutral spirits, all that kind of stuff. So if we look at the next slide, we'll show you a slide of columns, and these actually also come from Cooley. And the one on the left, we're looking at the first column here. The one on the right where the man doors are is a stainless steel column, and each door that you can see there is an inspection port that you can actually go in and have a look. And this is a sieve tray column, like we mentioned earlier, and each door represents a single plate. So you can see on that section there are 1, 2, 3, 4 plates even, and there could be about 7 or 8 of these sections in the column, and it could be up to about 40 foot high. So this column will be producing somewhere around about 1,200 litres of alcohol an hour, which is quite a lot. So the wash is going in at the top, going down through the column and out the bottom as spent wash. And you can see that sight glass is a yellow liquid, so you can see that it's corn. If it was wheat, it'd be much browner, but that's a corn wash going through there. So once you have your spirit coming off there, it comes off around 45% alcohol that's collected, and then it's fed into the column on the left. Now, in some cases, you can have an intermediate column, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But we're just looking at a rectifier here at the moment, and In that section near the bottom, you'll see two little parts where that's the feed going into the column. So you can actually put your alcohol in, and this is about just a bit more than halfway up the column. The alcohol will distill up in strength as it goes up through the column, but the water will go down and out the bottom. And you can also draw off different alcohol concentrations, and in those you will get what we call the fusel oils and the heads. The heads off the top, fusel oils lower down the column, and near the top of the column is where we draw off the grain spirit to make our grain whiskey. And if you look on the right hand side, there's a column that's been split in half, and you can see the bubble caps and the downcomer. That's where the liquid will go down to the next plate. And below that is a representation of what a bubble cap looks like. I mentioned sieve tray, but bubble cap is another way. And you can just about see the way the vapor goes up, the cap forces it down through the slits. The slits are in the liquid, so the vapor has to go through the liquid to escape up to the next plate. And this is another way of, this is probably an earlier mechanism by which these things were done. On the next slide, we can see a representation of this would be similar to what we're doing in Cooley or in Irish distillers, or a lot of distilleries for making grain spirit. I'm only showing the last two columns here because this is where the more interesting ones. You have your 45% alcohol coming in there into the surge tank, and from there it's pumped into what we call an extractive distillation column. This is a little bit more complex than what we were talked about in the previous column. Here we have the feed going in at the middle. We're adding water, which is wastewater from the previous distillation. It's coming in at the top of that ED column. And as the water will tend to flow down through the column and out the base and bring it with it some alcohol. So the alcohol going in at 45, the water in at the top, steam goes in at the bottom as well, but the alcohol strength at the bottom is maintained around about less than 20%. The vapor that goes through all of this water goes through the top of the column into a condenser, and some of this liquid can be returned, and that's called reflux. And you can control the strength of the top of the column by having a high reflux or the amount of reflux that you actually achieve. But some of this is drawn off as heads, and this would have compounds like ethyl acetate and acetaldehyde, methanol, and other obnoxious little things like acetaldehyde that make your eyes water, and they're collected in a heads receiver. But what we're interested in is what's coming out at the bottom of the column. And you know the way a lot of people say that how Irish whiskey is triple distilled. There's a little bone of contention here, because if it's coming out the bottom of the column, is it actually already, is it double distilled here or not? And I'm not going to get into that debate, but there is a question about that in this regard, because it's coming out the bottom. So that liquid is pumped into our rectifier on the right. And like I said earlier, this number on the side, that number 15 is roughly where the spirit is entering the rectifier. So steam goes in at the bottom. The alcohol will quickly vaporize in here and rise up through the column. And you can see that on plate 20, where the fusel oil draw off is, the alcohol strength there is about 65% alcohol. Now, I could go into all the details on a little bit, might go into a little bit more detail later on, but that is the strength at which you will get the highest concentration of amyl alcohol in your liquid phase. Okay, and it's very important that that is where you draw off your fusel oil. That's where you'll get most of your oils coming off. You will also take some propanol off there as well, and that's the next couple of plates up. And then towards the top of the column, you're at the very top of the column, you have your vapor going up, condensing, and you have again your reflux. Some of the vapor that it doesn't go back in that first reflux goes across to what we call a vent condenser. And this is the really volatile material that is condensed and cooled and come out down into your heads receiver. So there'll be a small amount going back into the column, but you'll be taking a small amount of heads. And it doesn't have to be a whole lot. It's a very small fraction of the overall distillate. So also, then you want to take your spirit. And again, I should point out that because your heads are in a vapor phase going up through the column, you don't see them in the spirit drawn off as a liquid. So the liquid is drawn off there on plate 70. And for our case, it says 94.8. It has to be less than 94.8. So the actual strength there is typically around 94.7% alcohol. And that would be for grain whiskey production. Now, I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions about this as we go along. So at this stage, I think we're going to take a short break and we'll be back to you in a minute.
Hi, Noel, thank you so much for that. A lot to get our teeth into there, but really, really interesting and very informative. Just while you get a little bit of refreshment there, I hope everybody else is having a little sip as well. I think it actually might be an opportune moment to just mention the fact that we here in Powerscourt Distillery, I think sustainability was always at the forefront of the design of the building, and especially the building project team led by Noel and Jerry. We always intended, and we do use the bio gas, and we also put in place our heat recovery system, which actually uses the heat from the stills to power the underfloor heating here in the distillery. So we were always trying to future-proof the building, and I think as we're talking about the stills tonight, we would like to just lay that accolade at the floor of the stills. I think we'll be talking about other areas of the spent grain and so on as we go forward into the more chemical part. But just while we're on this section, Noel, we have a couple of questions in there from Owen, Emma, and I think it's Jer, around the stills. So in terms of the still design and the flavor, do they have to be copper, first of all? And how much does the design of the still influence the actual style of the whiskey?
Well, first of all, I'm going to talk quite extensively on copper and what it adds to the production of spirit in general and whiskey in particular. In relation to the design of the stills, I think that there are different opinions on that. In Irish distillers, for example, they use very, very large stills, and typically as well, they don't fill them as high as you would in Scotch production or in other distilleries. And Irish distillers would have capacities of something like 85,000 litres, and they're probably only filling them to something in the region of half of that, or even 2/3. So it does depend on what exactly the tradition as well has been in how they produce their spirits. So the designs are varied. Sometimes you see different shapes and stills, and they all have some contribution, but again, it's questionable as to how much that does actually reflect in the spirit they're producing.
Does the wash still and the spirit still generally have a slightly different shape? Just as a rule of thumb.
They don't have to be. I mean, that's entirely up to the distiller and the designer of the plant to do that, but they may, when Irish distillers were moving their pot stills from John's Lane down to Cork, and Jameson similarly moved down. They had people, they bought new stills, but they made sure that they had the different dings and bings and dents in the still that they had before, so that they had the exact same spirit being produced.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, look, that was a couple of questions relating to that part. So I think as I say, we're going to get into the more science side of it here.
Yeah.
So just a few more minutes, but we got some great knowledge being shared with us here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. So
back to the boring old slideshow, and we're going to talk a bit now about copper and what's the whole story about copper. So our pot stills are typically made, but they have to be made of a very high grade copper, And typically this would be well over 99%. So, and column stills can be made both with copper and or with stainless steel. However, typically the sections that are above the feed pipe on the wash still would have copper. And in some cases, if you have stainless steel columns, they tend to put in what they call sacrificial copper, so that the spirit can take in the copper in solution. And the reason that copper is so important is because in fermentation and in cereals, there are sulfur compounds that are present there, and copper will complex in or react with the sulfur to produce copper sulfate. And copper sulfate, you can see sometimes if you look closely at the safe of a spirit still, it'll have a kind of a greeny blue tinge to it. The green is usually oxidized copper, but the blue is what you're looking for, and that would be the bluestone or copper sulfate residues after the spirit would evaporate away. It'll leave behind the copper stone, so, or the copper bluestone, as I said. So the next slide, and that's why copper is so important. And these are just a list of the kinds of noxious compounds that you can find in both unaged and aged whiskey. Because you will also get copper in the wood that you can use in maturation, and we'll talk about that in the next webinar. But typically wine casks would have been purified at the wineries by adding sulfur and burning sulfur. And if you're tasting whiskey, you will notice that sulfur from that source tends to taste a little bit like, if you remember those kind of red rubber tubes, that kind of a rubbery taste, and it's not very nice at all, and needs to be kind of, well, I'm not saying that most people don't like it, but some people do like it. So I mean, everybody has their own taste, but that's kind of flavor that you get from sulfur coming from a wine cask. Sulfur coming from a wash or distillate or beer will typically have a kind of flavor of rotten eggs, because it's H2S is what's formed there. So we move on to the next slide. This is an example of another fractional distillation. I mentioned that earlier, and the guy that kind of invented this whole style of distilling or made it popular in whiskey was a man called Ignace Coffey, and he born in 1780 and died in 1852. And at that stage, Irish whiskey was at its boom, and it was after that the whole industry went into decline in Ireland. And the stills that you're looking at there are actually in Kilbeggan, and they were probably made for India in about early 1900, but they have since found their way back. I don't think they ever got out there because of, I think it was 1930s or something like that, because of World War II. And they ended up in Kilbeggan as more or less a museum piece, for the want of a better word. So we go on to the next slide. And this is a representation again of kind of alcohol volume and temperature. And I mentioned earlier, if you had a liquid mixture of 50-50, if you go over there to the 50% by volume, you're going up to the green line, and you cut across to the left, you'll see the alcohol would boil around about 83 degrees centigrade. I wasn't far out, was I? Anyway, these graphs are handy for this kind of demonstration. But if we start again and look at the 10% alcohol, and that now typically boils, if you go right up there to the green line, around 93 or 92.5 degrees centigrade. And when it does the vapor, if you cut across to the right, straight across to the red line, to the right, you'll see the vapor content is somewhere around about 51 or 52% alcohol, because you can drop down. And again, if that liquid at 55 is distilled, you'll see that the alcohol content will quickly crosses over to somewhere around about 82 or 83% alcohol. Now that's if you just had a liquid at that strength, and that vapor would be that strong when it condenses. But in a typical distillation, you find that the distillate will, the liquid in the pot still will first alcohol come off strong, and as that goes, distills across, the liquid in the pot still is weaker, so the strength of the distillate drops, and it takes about 8 to 10 hours to run a distillation. And as I said, it starts off maybe at 40–50% alcohol and drops steadily down to zero. So when you get your initial distillation done and completed, you have a tank with around about 21% alcohol. So that's the combination of both the strong and the weak, and that's how you end up with your low wines at 20% alcohol, even though you've distilled it once. So just to explain why that happens and how that happens. So on the next slide, we're going back now to say, well, why are we distilling, and where are all these flavors coming from that you're getting in your spirit? And this schematic represents the kind of a cell of yeast, and you have the inputs at the top there. You have fatty acids, carbohydrates, and amino acids. Amino acids are basically the source of food for the yeast, and they're important. They're proteins that are in the wash, and they're also kind of coming from nitrogen compounds. The fatty acids are also in the beer from some of them from the malt, and everybody knows if you smell malt, it's got that flavor and maltiness, but and these flavors and tastes are all coming in some form or another, like a fatty acid. So that's what you smell. And carbohydrates is basically, that's your starch converted into sugar. And again, that gives you your different flavors again as it goes through the cell. And out the other end, we get again fatty acids on the left, and these are different to the ones going in, and it could be some of them might be there as well, but typically they're changed into other acids. Esters, and this tend to be the fruitier compounds that we know of. Aldehydes, a little bit more spiciness, and as I mentioned, things like acetaldehyde kind of make you go so bitterness and that kind of stuff, and alcohols. So we're going to have a look at all of these in the chemistry of them, and if you skip on to the next one, we have an indication there of what these chemical oxygen in a you can see a double bond oxygen onto a carbon, and then other little bits and pieces. And in the esters, you have again similar. It's all about the way that they name these things is on the structure of the cells. And finally, the other compounds that can be produced, and the one at the top there is another kind of alcohol with no H on it, typical. The one at the bottom, sulfire, is involved, and these are kind of the chemical, how they would look chemically. So we'll nip on to the next slide. We will see that fatty acids come in different grades, I suppose, and we talk about the short chain fatty acids and these will be 6 carbons to 8 carbons in length, and these are typically formed in early fermentation. The medium chain esters from C10 to 12 are quite evenly produced throughout the fermentation, and the long chain esters 6 up to 16 mostly are part of the cell wall of the and when the yeast cell dies and breaks down, that's when you get the long chain fatty acids being released. So if you also notice that increased cell growth usually results in lower levels of esters, and that's due to the lower levels of fatty acids in the wort. I mentioned earlier that there were fatty acids in the wort. So if the cell growth, if you've increased cell growth, then they kind of use those fatty acids to build membranes in the cell, and that's where they go. Organic acids are formed throughout fermentation at high levels, and they produce notes like vinegar or vomit and barnyard kind of smells. So again, we have to be careful on how these are formed, and that we monitor and take appropriate action on fermentations. So the right proportion of fusel oils and free fatty acids or acetate is crucial when producing estuary wort, and that's in relation to, we've talked about clear wort and cloudy wort in mashing. Clear wort would have more of the sweeter tone notes that we would prefer in our whiskey probably, and avoiding those kind of solventy notes that you would get, and other from excess alcohol and or rancid aromas, and from excess free fatty acids, which is another style of fatty acid. And estery or fruity wort, and that's what I mentioned about the clear wort, can give us, we get more fruitiness in it if we have warmer fermentation. So again, that's down to the temperature in the fermenter, and we mentioned how to control that temperature to keep it not too hot but warm. And if you have longer fermentation times, it helps with these fruity notes. And again, if you're using higher original gravities, high pitching rates with yeast, we mentioned how much yeast you should use, and whether the yeast has been grown either aerobically or even the nitrogen levels in barley. These all affect the kind of esters that we're going to produce in fermentation. And also, if you go follow on down, the increased glucose levels tend to produce more short chain esters. So isoamyl acetate is a typical flavor of a kind of banana aroma, and that can be produced if the increased glucose levels. And high fermentation temperature, then the other end of the scale, and you can produce more acid esters. And again, you're looking at fruity aromas, but medium and long chain ethyl esters, which can give you an oily and waxy texture to the flavor. So again, these are decisions that are made by the distiller, the brewer as well at times, and whoever's involved in the fermentation side of things, to give you different flavors within the whiskey. So if we go on to the next slide, we're looking at different styles here, and we'll just skip this slide, I think, to move on to the next one, John. Fusel oils are also something you don't particularly like, and the table here shows you how amino acids create, or the amino acids on the left will, when the yeast metabolizes these, produce the fusel oils which are on the right. So isoamyl alcohol is typical fusel oil, isobutanol and amyl alcohol, and so on. So the other esters that are produced now, we're going to show you a list of these and the kind of flavors that they represent. So you have your odor, or in the second column and the fourth one, and the ester name and on the left of that. So you can see here all the various types of flavors, and these are the chemicals that create those flavors. So I'd have to get my glasses on to read them all out, but you're looking at things like again, amyl acetate giving you that apple or banana. I think we mentioned pineapple up there is butyl burate. I mean, some lovely difficult pronunciations there to get your hand around. And all of these then have different boiling points, and will have different make different combinations in your distillate. Now, a lot of these are in very, very small compounds. We're talking about concentrations. We're talking about parts per million in relation to ethanol. So, and typically that's what they're measured in. So something like ethyl acetate might be there in about 30 parts per million, and that's all it needs to be for you to taste it. So we move on to the next slide. The alcohols that are produced, and I've given you an indication here of boiling points, and you can see ethanol up there, 78 degrees centigrade, and then you have other ones down at the very bottom. You have things like octanol is 195 degrees, things in more typically amyl alcohol 132, 138, those kind of figures, 128, 112. So that higher boiling point ones, these are the ones that are in the tails, and some of these we don't particularly like. And for those of you that are interested in what these are, you have a little explanation there of the homogeneous azeotropes. So if the constituents of a mixture are completely miscible in all proportions with each other, the type of azeotrope is called an homogeneous azeotrope. Now, I hope you all got that, because I'll be asking questions after this. And then you have the heterogeneous azeotrope, is where the constituents are not completely miscible. Now, miscible means, for example, ethanol and water will mix together, and you wouldn't know whether it was alcohol or water, the same clear looking liquid. That's a miscible material. In heterogeneous azeotrope, you might have oiliness in there. So if you can imagine something like if you mix oil and with water, it doesn't mix very easily, but you can get a cloudiness, and that's kind of what we're talking about here. So in those kind of situations, they boil and react differently in the column or in the distillation still. So that's the point, and they have different boiling points as a result. So we'll go on to the next slide. This is what we call a gas chromatograph of malt whiskey, and this was done by a colleague of mine from way back. I'll tell you about him another day. This actually schematic was created by a guy called Kevin McNamara, who I worked with good while ago. He's since retired. He was the chemist in Irish Distillers. And this represents, each one of these peaks or points numbered represent a compound which is listed on the left-hand side of this slide. So at the very left-hand side, number 1 is that nasty little one, acetaldehyde. And this acetaldehyde would have a boiling point of around 36 degrees centigrade. So it's very volatile. And number 2 is ethyl acetate. And again, that's the kind of fruity one we were talking about earlier. And the next one, number 4, and if you look on the schematic, they're numbered. You see the small little peak, that might be about 5 or 10 parts per million, but acetal is that one we mentioned about, it's kind of buttery flavor to it. So it can be kind of an interesting compound. Then the main big one there beside that is ethanol. And then number 5, we're looking at propanol. Methanol is in there too, between 4, but you can't really see it. It's kind of hidden with number 4. Sorry, 4 is methanol. I'm sorry, I'm mistaken. Number 3 is there, is the ethyl acetate. And then 5, these are produced in what we call a gas chromatograph. And this is typically now of maybe a couple of thousand plates in a column. And that's the level of distillation that you have to get to separate these compounds out to the level that you see on this chromatograph, and that's done in 43 minutes to go through that column and come out the other side. And these are the spikes that represent those compounds. And as you can see, further down you go, 10 and 11 I think would be the amyl alcohols that you would get in typical, and they're the more heavier compounds down that end. So we'll nip on to the next slide. Again, it's a diagram, and this is basically shows you if you have 2 mixtures, the red one and the green one. At the bottom there, you can see the red one is at 0 concentration and the green one is at 100%. So this could be typically of water and alcohol. So that's gives you the kind of vapor liquid comparison again. So we've seen that already. So we'll just nip on to the next slide. Again, this is for if you're going to produce a 100% ethanol, you have azeotropic distillation, which is another aspect of distilling, where you have to introduce something to take out the remaining water. And you typically use, in this case, you would use something like cyclohexane. And what happens there is the water will mix with the cyclohexane, and you can then distill the alcohol away because it separates. So the water and cyclohexane will separate out, and you're left with just cyclohexane and ethanol, and that's how you are able to distill it apart then and get pure alcohol. And the next slide. This is our team in the distillery, and these guys are who I owe everything to, because these are the guys that do the work. I only do all the talk. And so on the left you have Dara, Mikey, myself, of course, and I see I'm the smallest as well. And then Nicholas and Jonathan, and these guys are backbone of our distilling and distillation. And finally, I'm going to leave you with a slide of a decent dram of whiskey. And that concludes my presentation. Open for a few questions now, maybe, if I'm still sober at the end of it.
Well, Noel, you definitely deserve a sup after that. Really interesting, lots of detail to get our teeth into. We had a question there from Laurie earlier on, wanted to know what the best course was in terms of getting into distilling, but I'm sure you've given her a good run on it now, and maybe we'll take that one offline to get back to her directly.
Yeah.
There is just a couple of questions. There's one that came in during the week there from Connor, and a similar question has come in from Michael, and that is really, does the width of the swan neck and the length of the lin arm have an influence on the flavour of the whiskey?
I'm always reluctant to say no to any of these things, but because everything has some kind of an influence. There's no two ways about it. It's not that simple. Everything has an effect. So the length of the line arm, typically, it's not going to have a huge effect. The height of the line arm from the still can be important, but that then, for example, if you run the still too hard, put too much heat in, you get carryover, and you don't want that in your distillate. So that can have an effect. So if you have a short neck, you have more risk of carryover and therefore contamination in your low wines. But again, if you know what you're dealing with, it's easy to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think tonight is definitely an illustration of how precise and the expertise required to really distill whiskey and get. It's so interesting to understand where all the different smells are coming from in the esters. And who knew there was fatty acids in Irish whiskey? We were delighted to learn that it was gluten-free there a few weeks ago. So maybe the Irish answer to avocado. But we had another question from Rajin, who had sent it in again during the week, but I think we covered that one, Rajin, for you, which is the difference between triple distilled and single pot still whiskey. So I think we covered that in the first section. Just one other one then, Noel, was on the spent grain. Is that taken from the three stills or just one in particular?
The spent grains come from the mash tun, and they don't come from the stills at all. What we get from the bottom of the still is what we call pot ale. In the first still, pot ale would be what's the residue after we've distilled the low wines out. And pot ale would be high in protein because of the yeast content, and that can be used directly as a feed for pigs or other animals, but we avoid, you shouldn't give it to sheep because it's high in copper. And then the other stills, the residues from that would be mostly water, and they would be what we call spent lees. And they can also be added to the pot ale, but most farmers would prefer if you didn't. So that can be disposed of separately.
Okay, great. We just had a question there from Brian with regards to the 10-year-old, which is our single grain. So he was wondering, was that originally produced in column stills?
Yes.
Great, okay. Again, lots of interest here on careers in distilling. Roisin is looking to ask about apprenticeship and the best courses to get into distilling. And I know, just to let people know, we have casking and maturation next week, and then we have a full tasting on the 14th of May, which I hope you'll all join us for. And you can order the trilogy pack online. Everyone who's registered for the webinar this evening will receive a discount, which can be used online. So we'd love to have you all with your whiskey in front of you to work through that. But the following week, we are going to go into a little bit of detail on your early career in distilling, Noel, and how you got into that. So that hopefully will give some information to people who are really, really interested in that, which is great. So I think, was there one other one there from Owen, kind of a more technical one? We may have actually answered that one earlier on. I'll just double check we cover that one. Sorry, there is actually, Sergio was wondering what kind of pressures build up in the stills, and also does the wash charger affect the finished product?
First of all, the pressure in the stills, no, the pressure is not very, very high. Again, we're looking in columns more so than in pot stills. The pressure in a column still could be about half a bar at the bottom. And that's, if you can imagine the amount of liquid that's on each plate and adding that up, that's effectively the pressure is the weight of liquid on the bottom of the still. So it's not very high. In the pot stills, again, very, very little in the way of pressure. The still is actually vented to atmosphere, but through the pot, seal pot. So there's absolutely little or no pressure in the still, but it does create a little bit to get the vapor to travel across to the condenser, but it's minimal in a pot, more so in a column at the bottom of the column. But again, the column stills are vented to atmosphere as well. So at the top, there's no pressure, it's just at the bottom.
Okay. And Noel was just wondering, what could you have some sort of refrigerated unit instead of the worm?
Refrigeration is expensive because water is much more readily available and can be reused, and you can reuse the heat coming from the water, as we do, to heat the visitor center and the underfloor heating. So you can reuse
and much more eco-friendly.
Of course. I mean, it's all about minimizing the carbon footprint as much as we can, and renewable energy and all the rest of it. So we use renewable gas in the distillery and power court as well. So it's all trying to be as energy efficient and as we can.
And sustainable, absolutely. And so just look, one final question, so obviously we have come up to the hour mark, but as we said at the beginning, this is really the heart of the whole whiskey making process, so really deserves some time, and you've given some fantastic detail in your presentation there, so it'll be available for everybody on YouTube in the coming days, and certainly you know, we'll revisit it to digest it. But Owen had one question there. So do you use GC or GC-MS when developing your process specific styles of whiskey? Bit of a technical one.
Gas liquid chromatography is what he's talking about, the gas chromatography. The early stages of gas chromatography, we used to use what it called was an FID, which is a flame identification detector. And that was where the compounds come out at the end and they're burnt, and you get a reaction to give you a peak, and that was what you looked at on that slide. Mass spec is much more complex and measures the mass of the atoms that are after passing through the GC. Much more accurate measurement of the compounds, and a lot of distilleries, most malt whiskey distilleries wouldn't have that technology available to them. They would have to go outsource it, but the larger distilleries, the likes of Irish distillers, would have their own setup for doing GC and MS. It's more useful in a kind of grain distillery where you have to have constant monitoring of the spirit that's being produced, because again, it's a continuous process, and little tweaks on steam and volumes and to keep the column balanced. It's much easier to do it with a GC and have either mass spec or FID detectors to fingerprint the spirit that you're producing and maintain it. If you have malt whiskey when you're setting it up, it's useful, but it's not 100% necessary. If you have a good process and a good process control, you don't need to do GCs on it every week.
Okay, thanks for that, Noel. And just the last one I skipped over there, Colin, sorry about that. He was just asking at what point you would take the alcohol to make the hand sanitizer. Now, obviously, the hand sanitizer has been very much in the news over the last number of weeks, and some distilleries have been doing it. And we obviously aren't doing it, but perhaps you could give a little bit of light on that one.
Yeah, I mean, the World Health Organization recommends that the hand sanitizer, to be effective, needs to be 80% alcohol. Our distillery will only produce, currently we produce at 76% alcohol. We could produce it at 80% alcohol. The production of our spirit is relatively slow. We produce 1,000 LPAs a day, in a shift. Whereas if you go to the grain distillery with those continuous columns, they can produce 1,000 litres of alcohol in 2 hours. In Middleton and Cork, they're producing massive amounts of, 1 million litres a week. So they have much, and at about a fraction of the cost of what it would cost to produce alcohol from a malt distillery. Having said that, anybody that has contacted us in relation to hand sanitizer, we have sourced alcohol and or the hand sanitizer itself for people because of our contacts within the industry of spirit production. And there are licensing requirements required to be able to produce it. You have to denature the alcohol. You have to have the denaturants to do that. You have to add glycerine and other components like sodium hypochlorite. And if you're starting with a 76% alcohol, you can't produce an 80% alcohol base if you have to add those ingredients into it. Now, the HSE have said that they will accept a hand sanitizer, I think, of about 60% alcohol. But I would prefer to stick with the World Health Organization recommendation. And and again, these things are very relatively, the production of them isn't the problem. It's having the facilities to bottle it in an efficient way and to get it to the public as well. So there are various outlets for it at the moment, and there doesn't seem to be that big of demand for it in Ireland at the moment. Irish distillers have arranged to supply everything that the HSE needs through their Cork plant, and I know that Great Northern Distillery are making a lot of alcohol available as well for hand sanitizer, and if there was a need for it, we would be delighted to supply alcohol, but it's not, I don't believe that it's necessary or there is a need to make it locally in Enniskerry. And
at the moment.
So there's plenty of hand sanitizer out there at the moment.
That's great, Noel. Thank you for clarifying that for us. So just to wrap it up, one other comment there from Rosemary. She had a lovely visit to the distillery last year, and thanks for your comments, Rosemary. We are all looking forward to the day we can open our doors again and welcome everybody back. In the meantime, we'll be here every week with Noel's Grains of Wisdom, and we'll be looking forward to sharing those with you and helping you on your whiskey journey, learning about the whiskey making process, and having conversations with lots of interesting people in the industry. So in the meantime, we would be very grateful if you could follow us on all our social media platforms. As I said, our webinar this evening will be available on YouTube. It's a very substantial one, so it'll be great to be able to go back over and review that. I know I certainly will. And again, thank you for joining us, and please do use your codes to order your trilogy packs for our tasting, which is on the 14th of May. We look forward to welcoming you then, and indeed next week for our casking and maturation. So in the meantime, stay well, stay safe, and sláinte.